You're dead. Should be the place you're connecting with. Do we? Is it right? Like, where's the speaker? Is he joining virtually? I thought he was in person.
Give his number. I can also email him.
I can quickly text him. He's probably on his way.
Yeah, I can let him in downstairs actually.
He's on the, yeah, he should be, you put him on the list, right?
Yeah. Okay, I'll be.
Yeah, I did it. Should I send it again? That's okay. It's totally fine.
It's really cool that all the different rooms are named after different cities.
Yeah. In the old hub, so we've only been in this hub about a year in this physical space. The same concept was in a different physical space, like two blocks away. And in that one, the cities were based on spaces where big international treaties around things like corruption and transparency and so on have been signed. I don't quite remember if this was the same logic with the decisions on the names, but yeah.
It's really cool.
Yeah, it does add to the feel, I think, of the place.
You do projects in
Hello.
Ethiopia?
Hi.
Hi.
I'm so sorry. I cut it pretty close. I actually got lost.
But you made it here on Monday.
Yeah. I'm terrible with directions.
You made it. It's really
Yeah.
fun.
Hello.
Good.
Could you just give me a minute or two to
Yeah, gather
Thank you.
yourself.
Yeah, I just need to gather my thoughts.
No worries.
Thank you.
For those of we're really excited to have Abrahim Shah with us today to talk to us about Balochistan and all the hands-on work and research he's done in the field. Ibrahim can introduce himself and tell us a little bit more about himself before we get started, but on behalf of Accountability Lab and Open GovHub, thank you so much for joining us. Ibrahim, take it away.
Hi everyone, good afternoon. Thank you for being here, for taking our time. So as Sherry so kindly introduced me, my name is Abraham. I am working for the civil service in Pakistan. And this presentation that I will be doing has basically two facets. So what I'll be sort of focusing on is I'll be sharing the historical causes and the facets that actually led to the turbulence, or you could say the turmoil that you see in Balochistan. So that's going to be the first facet that we're going to be focusing on. The second facet is going to be more personal in nature, and the things that I've sort of learned while I've been in the province, my experience from working in the field, and what I sort of gathered from my time in Balochistan.
Stop sharing for I'll share on my screen. No worries. So
Okay.
you guys go.
So this slide I added, not so much that you guys get to know about me, but so that you can sort of become acquainted with the work that I do. So I am part of the district administration in Pakistan, and this is a position that I think is very unique and peculiar to colonial society. So this institution, the district administration, you'll find in places such as India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan or Afghanistan for that matter. And how I define this is, so Pakistan is basically a federal state. You have provinces, and within those provinces, you have what we call districts, such as the District of Columbia. So within those districts, you have further areas of jurisdiction that we, in our language, call tehsil, but in English, we refer to them as subdivisions. So I feel like the analogy that might work here, and I'm not too sort of familiar with the American structure, but how you, let's say, have the District of Columbia, then within the District of Columbia, I think you have counties, and then you have cities. So cities, I think, or counties are the ones that would align with my area of jurisdiction, that is a subdivision. So of that subdivision, I am the assistant commissioner, and we act as the principal representatives of the state. So anything that happens on a governmental level, any sort of service, any form of work, the government is undertaking happens through the office of the district administration. So think about municipal services, think about waste collection, think about education, supervision of health, checking your health department, checking your schools, law and order. So there's a protest, there's an electricity shortage, everything sort of goes through our office. So this really gives us, a unique platform where you can really understand how society functions, and you get to understand how things are not just on the policy level, but also on the grassroots level. So on a daily basis, for instance, you're interacting with ministers, you're interacting with people on the ground, you're interacting with civil society, you're interacting with people who, let's say, are facing a shortage of electricity, who are out on the road to protest. So this gives us a very good window into understanding how, like I said, society is functioning. And that's the platform that I'll be using and the insight that I'll be using to sort of share more about Balochistan with you. So here's a small, you could say, map of Balochistan. And I want you guys to sort of get a sense of the area that I'm discussing about, because I need you to picture what all of this is. So this, as you can see, is Balochistan. Where it says number one, that's the capital, so that's Quetta. That's where I was posted for 6 months. And prior to that, this is Khuzdar, and that was my first posting actually. And I'll get to sort of the details about Khuzdar and what a turbulent area it was. But what Balochistan represents is that this is nearly 50% of Pakistan's entire landmass. So if you put all of the other provinces together on one side and Balochistan on the other, this takes up almost as much space, 47% of the entire landmass. And even more interestingly, towards the west, you have Afghanistan. So there's nearly a 1600-mile border running with Afghanistan that, as I'm sure all of you are aware, has remained quite turbulent and even violent. And here you have Iran. So this is a 600-mile border with Iran. So in total, Balochistan shares a 2200-mile border with two countries that Pakistan hasn't historically been very comfortable with. So interestingly, you might not know this, but when Pakistan applied for membership to the UN, Afghanistan was the only country that opposed its entry. And Iran, things were friendly with Iran, to some degree still are, but things sort of declined and became more challenging post 1979 and post sort of the Iranian Revolution. So while you get a sense of the territorial idea of Balochistan, here's just a quick sort of run through statistics of Balochistan. So like I said, 47% of Pakistan's landmass, and you only have 12 million people residing there. So it's very sparsely populated. The urban density, population density is quite low, and coupled with very rugged terrain, it becomes very difficult to manage and govern. So imagine, barren mountains, sand dunes, and populations that are very sparsely populated. So when you're living there, if you go through the main highway, there might not be, you would pass through maybe 50 miles, 100 miles till you actually see a concrete structure. There's just maybe sand houses and sand dunes and not a lot of sort of population. Another very interesting thing about Balochistan, this is something that came as a surprise to me as well, was the ethnic diversity that this place boasts. So in the north, where you sort of have these blue areas and Pishin, Quetta, all of this is the Pashtun belt, the Pashtun belt. So you have Pathans here, and then towards this belt, the Khuzdar belt, you have what we call the Brohi, the Bravi. They're a subset of the Baloch. They have their own language, and to a lot of degree, they consider themselves different from the Baloch as well. And Persian spoken here as well. So that's something very interesting too, because Persian is sort of a dying language in Pakistan. But in this particular belt, you'll actually find government documents, records in Persian. And towards the west, you have sort of the actual Baloch belt, the people mostly who are Baloch. So you have, let's say, Gwadar, you have Panjgur, Haran, Washok, and these are the areas that are more sort of turbulent when it comes to the Baloch insurgency. So there's a lot of ethnic diversity here at play, which naturally sort of, tugs at the fabrics of the social landscape as well, and poses its own sort of unique challenges. So this is the crux of my presentation, and where I would really sort of urge you guys to focus and really try to get a sense of what I'm trying to say. So you got a sense of how geographically laid out Balochistan is. And towards understanding what causes the turbulence and the turmoil, we actually need to go before 1947, so when Pakistan became independent. So a lot of the challenges that existed in Balochistan have occurred during the colonial period. And that's because of two primary reasons. So Balochistan, you could say, has had two sort of elements during the colonial period. One was that Balochistan was always seen by the British state as a security buffer, as a zone against Russian intervention and invasion in Afghanistan. So both Balochistan and Afghanistan were more like these buffer zones that acted between the British Empire on the one hand and the Russian Empire on the other. So what this necessarily meant was that unlike the rest of the British Empire, in places such as Punjab, the central provinces, the United Provinces, Balochistan never really developed that administrative or civil infrastructure that the British Empire left in other parts of Pakistan. So in reality, what was happening was that because you were seeing this particular area as just a security, from a security prism or a security lens, all that was maintained here was a garrison state. So it was seen as this sort of, like I said, security buffer. So you only had very massive military presence. So the Quetta garrison, for instance, which is here, is one of the biggest garrisons, military garrisons in Pakistan, because it covers this entire area, but also sort of overlooks the borders with Afghanistan and Iran. So on the one hand, what's happening is that Balochistan is lacking sort of that civic or administrative infrastructure that the rest of Pakistan has. And mind you, why the British actually built that civic infrastructure was to generate revenue. So it wasn't sort of something, to be very candid, altruistic, but it was sort of because agriculture was the main source of income during those times. The British developed irrigation, the British developed these transportation mechanisms that allowed them to sort of harness and take out the maximum revenue from places like Punjab. But post-independence, that very same infrastructure, or you could say development, was lacking in Balochistan. So prior to 1947, like I said, on the one hand, you have this security dynamic at play, but even more interesting, what's happening is the sense of Baloch identity and nationalism that existed prior to 1947. So this map will sort of help you understand that. On the one hand, you see this pink area. That is what was known as the Chief Commissioner's Province, or the British Balochistan. So this part was the one that was sort of amalgamated and assimilated into the British Empire. While this part of the area, so you have Kalat, Haran, Sarawan, Lasbela, Makran, this was what was actually known as the Khanat, or the empire, or the state of Kalat. So Kalat was actually this independent state that was, it wasn't fully independent, it was obviously attached to the British Empire as a vassal. But what you need to sort of focus on and need to sort of realize is that even before 1947, there was this sense of Baloch nationalism and identity at play. And that was happening through this particular area. So for instance, the Khan of Kalat was recognized as a sovereign entity by the British. They had their own laws, policies. Of course, they couldn't sort of engage in foreign policy or defense agreements with other countries, but the British allowed them a measure of autonomy and independence. So prior to 1947, what's happening is, I'll just recap, there's this security dynamic at play. You have this very heavy military presence and the lack or dearth of a civic infrastructure. And that is coupled with this sense of Baloch identity and nationalism, which is permeating all of Balochistan and which claims that we're actually independent and autonomous. So now let's juxtapose that with what happens in 1947, the 14th of August, and that is the independence of Pakistan. So here again, I just want you to sort of make a mental map and sort of, imagine and go through history with me. So imagine it's the 14th of August, 1947, and Pakistan has just been born out of this massive upheaval, this tumultuous independence struggle, which has seen the greatest migration in the history of humankind, right? So 10 million people moved between Pakistan and India during 1947. So imagine you are part of the Muslim League and you have this massive country to look after. So Pakistan is the west wing, this is West Pakistan, and Bangladesh, Dhaka is East Pakistan. So you have two wings of a country, just newly, like I said, born out of violence and born out of tumult, just recently becoming independent. And that is separated by thousands of miles of enemy territory. So remember, India is seen as the arch nemesis of Pakistan. So on the one hand, what's happening is that there's such a disparate community, such a disparate sort of population, separated physically as well, and you have this sense of insecurity. So what's happening in 1947 is that while you've come through this, you've managed to sort of survive the initial few months, you've managed to consolidate yourself, but there's always this sense of insecurity. There's always this fear that India will gobble you up. So this narrative has been prevalent in history where a lot of claims were made from across the border that Pakistan is simply an aberration. It's a temporary development, and very soon it will return to the fold in India. So it will no longer exist. So once again, like I said, imagine history at that time. Imagine those times where, on the one hand, you're so physically divided, and there's this very real threat from a behemoth of a country, and which hasn't actually given you all of its resources as well, all of your share of the resources. So there's an existential threat that you're facing. And there's another very interesting thing that I'll tell you. So the movement that actually led to the independence of Pakistan, the party that was founded, the Muslim League, didn't actually have support or grassroots movement in the spaces that actually became Pakistan. So the Muslim League or most of the leaders belong from Muslim minority provinces. So imagine this once again. There's this existential threat. You're divided by area, and you lack grassroots movement within the provinces that you're now supposed to govern. So what do? What is the first step that you have to do? You have to shore up solidarity. You have to shore up, bonding and connection. And the question arises: how do you develop a connection, or how do you develop a sense of common identity between a Bengali living in Dhaka and a Pashtun living in Quetta, or a Baloch living in Makran, and a Sindhi living in Karachi, or in Urdu Mahaj? What is that one common strand that connects all of them? Religion. So that is how religion becomes such an important part in Pakistan's history. And you might have heard of this narrative such as Pakistan ka matlab kya? La ilaha illallah. What does Pakistan mean? There is no God but Allah. So refrains like these became very common in Pakistan, predominantly because religion was used by the state as a common denominating factor between people who had nothing else in common. So along with religion, another element that shaped Pakistan's identity was language. So in 1947, Urdu became the official national language of Pakistan, when in reality, according to the statistics of that time, only 6% of Pakistanis spoke Urdu. But again, Urdu was seen as that common factor, that sort of denominator that could, let's say, connect a Punjabi to a Pashtun to a Baloch to an Urdu-speaking person, Muhajir, to Bengali. So you have these two common strands, language and religion. Now I want you to sort of go back and think about what I said. So when you sort of need to, develop this homogeneous sense of identity, naturally what that requires is centralization, right? So it's imposition of a particular form of identity, a particular form of culture. But remember what I said earlier. Alongside this, in 1947, you had a very strong strand of Baloch nationalism and sense of identity and pride as well. So right from the very beginning in 1947, what's happening is that you're noticing a contradiction in the Pakistani state building project. And that contradiction is that the Pakistani state is trying to impose this monolithic, this homogeneous culture that contradicts these very powerful and these very dynamic strands of identity and ethnic independence. So now let's just put all of this into context, right? On the one hand, like I said, you have Balochistan, which has this sort of very strong garrison security presence. But on the other, you have this Pakistani state that is naturally insecure on account of its unique sort of model of decentralization, and that is trying to sort of centralize power and centralize decision making and culture towards the top. And at the same time, you have this very strong movement towards provincial autonomy and even nationalism in Balochistan. So in 1947, you start to notice these contradictions. And those contradictions actually give birth to a lot of the challenges that we see in Pakistan nowadays. Because what happens is, alongside sort of this monolithic move towards homogeneous culture, what also starts to happen is that you start to sort of centralize decision making, and centralizing resources. So that's one big issue that emerges. Countries such as, areas such as East Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sindh, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, they start to claim that the center has become too overbearing, and the center is dominated by two or one major ethnicity, initially the Urdu speaking, but then the Punjabi ethnicity. So they claim that their voices aren't reflected in decision making. And when their voices aren't reflected, naturally what tends to happen? Unrest starts to develop. So Balochistan from the very beginning, and that's exactly actually what happened with in 1971 as well. So when East Pakistan became independent and became Bangladesh, if you look at what the Awami League, the Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, who was the founder of Bangladesh, he actually laid out 6 points. And those 6 points said specifically these things, that we need economic autonomy. They even argued for a separate currency for East Pakistan. So this idea of centralization, this idea of sort of imposing a monolithic culture, and the sort of the concomitant centralization or monopolization of resources really lies at the heart of the challenges that places like Bangladesh and Balochistan have faced in Pakistan. And to sort of build further upon that, I have this small case study or case example for you guys, which is the NFC award. So the NFC award stands for the National Finance Commission Award. So like I said earlier, Pakistan by its constitution is a federal state, which means that power is supposed to rest with federating independent units, which in Pakistan's case happen to be provinces. But like I said, because there was this move towards centralization since the 1940s, most resources or most revenue lies at the federal level. So to resolve this dichotomy, when Pakistan's constitution came about in 1973, Pakistan has had three constitutions in its history, 1973 one being the most recent one. The NFC award was established, which would sort of split your fiscal resources between the center and the provinces. So prior to 2009, so what the constitution stipulates is that the NFC award is supposed to be revised after every 5 years, but the last NFC award happened in 2009. So that also gives you a sense of how sort of these strands or this conflict still sort of rests or emerges in Pakistan, because it's been 12 years since the NFC award was revised. So in 2009, the NFC award came about after a new democratic government came into place after 10 years of dictatorship. And one of the first things they did was to revise the NFC award. So prior to 2009, the NFC award was based solely on population. So think about it, Balochistan, sparsely populated, already lacking resources, and when you have to get a share of the resource pool, the factor that determines your share actually goes against you because you have very little population. So you're sort of trapped in this vicious cycle. And compared to Punjab, which is the most sort of prosperous and the most populous province, continues to sort of get extra shares, right? Because it's already doing well, the population is going up, so it's getting the lion's share of resources. But Balochistan, on the other hand, which doesn't have the same amount of population, whose population density is quite low, sort of lacks that access to those resources and doesn't get its fair share. So in 2009, that award gets revised, and you have new sort of indicators to determine the NFC award, and that is 82% population. You add up 10.3% for poverty and backwardness, you have 5% for revenue collection and generation, you have inverse population density. So for the first time in 2009, Balochistan's share of the federal pool of resources actually goes up. So as of now, Balochistan is receiving 9% of Pakistan's entire revenue. But what I want to highlight is sort of how long it took to move away from population as the determining factor until 2009, which is almost 62 years after independence. And since 2009, between 2009 and 2022, the NFC award hasn't been revised. So you again see these sort of, center province tensions, and you can probably now get a sense of where this Baloch grievance is emerging from, and this idea of that they're not getting, their fair share of resources. So once again, just to sort of quickly recap, I think two elements that I would, pick out of what I've said is Pakistan's unique experience with decolonization and the impact that had on shaping identity and nationalism. And second, Balochistan's own sort of unique experience in all of that, where you have a sense of Baloch nationalism, Baloch identity, and how these two strands are contradicting and conflicting with one another. So that was sort of the first facet or part of my presentation, I'll sort of now quickly walk you guys through of how the situation is now on the ground to sort of give you a sort of real-time picture of how things are. So I wanted to start with the political landscape. And one thing that is very unique to Balochistan in terms of sort of Pakistan's politics, well, not anymore, but over the last few years, is how uncertain politics has been in Pakistan, in Balochistan. So over the last, let's say, 10 years, Balochistan as a province has had 4 to 5 different chief ministers, all of whom haven't lasted for more than 2.5 years. And when I was there in 2021 as well, the then incumbent Chief Minister Jan Kamal Khan was ousted by his own party. He was actually doing a pretty good job bringing in innovation, but sadly, because of the nature of politics in Balochistan, he wasn't allowed to continue. And one thing that I particularly noticed, apart from sort of the uncertainty, is how there's this collective frustration towards the political class as well. So when you talk to people there, when you talk to sort of the middle class who are like aspiring for social and upward mobility, one thing you notice is that they claim that their viewpoints and their political aspirations have been hijacked by this political class, whom they claim isn't reflective of their interests or their sort of preferences. And they say that in the elections, it's usually the tribal sardars, the tribal chiefs who end up winning. And that's actually led to a lot of frustration politically, people claiming that this class doesn't reflect our aspirations. There's this disconnect sort of between the ground and the political sort of side. And why that hasn't sort of led to major upheaval or change has a lot of reasons, a lot of them that I can't talk about because of my position as a civil servant. But I do have a reading list at the end that you guys could explore, on your own. So, and because of that political uncertainty or sort of that fractured political landscape, that also spills into administrative and bureaucratic circles. So there's a lot of, even I face a lot of uncertainty in terms of my position, and I'll get to that later on. But just imagine a province where even the CM isn't sure of his position overnight. So how would that affect sort of long-term policies? How would that affect the chain of policy making and policy implementation on the ground? Then you have the economic aspect of it. So something very unfortunate about Balochistan, and this ties up to what I said earlier, is that there's no sort of economic infrastructure prevalent in Balochistan. It's barren land. The water table is quite low. Around Quetta, for instance, you would get water as low as 1,500 feet below the ground. So that's really expensive. You can't have irrigation. You can't have agriculture, and there's no industry. And tourism also is really sort of in its incipient stages because terrorism and violence have prevented sort of tourism picking up. So the major source of income or employment for most people is a massive informal economy of smuggling. So most people are engaged with, let's say, smuggling or cross-border trade with Afghanistan and Iran. And that's now posed new challenges because what's happened over the last year or so is that the Pakistani army and the Pakistani government has actually closed up the border. So there's a lot of fencing going around. And because of that fencing, that easy mobility or easy sort of transportation between, let's say, Pakistan and Iran or Taftan or Pakistan and Afghanistan and Chaman has really rescinded or it's really sort of gone down. And that's really hit incomes hard because, like I said, people were dependent on this informal economy for their livelihoods, for their sources of income because there were no other alternatives. And I think this picture captures this really well. So this is actually the border with Iran, and all of these trucks are carrying barrels of Iranian oil. So they buy these barrels really cheap. Then they bring them to Balochistan, sort of refine it, and then sell it at lower the market price. So most people actually run on smuggled Iranian oil in Balochistan. But this is a picture of when the border was closed down. So all of these trucks are standing on the other side, and just look at how far along the trucks are. They literally go as far as the eye can see. So even if, let's say, one truck is feeding a family of 6 or 7, there's almost, these are 1,000 trucks, almost 70,000, 7,000 truck people are impacted by this. So one major element of sort of the Balochistan conundrum or the challenges in Balochistan is the lack of a viable, economic heartbeat or economic source, livelihood, and this reliance on the informal economy. Another thing that I wanted to talk about, I think, is the Baloch insurgency, because a lot of misconceptions exist. So one thing that I'll be very I sort of go right off the bat is that the Baloch insurgency is not religious in nature. So this is in comparison to, let's say, the Taliban or the ISIS, which focus more on sort of religious elements, and and their end goal happens to be the Sharia or the imposition of Sharia in Pakistan. But for the Baloch, on the other hand, their radical movements or their insurgency focuses on the two strands that we've already talked about, which is autonomy, identity autonomy, nationalist autonomy, and economic autonomy. So these are the two strands that really shape Baloch insurgency. And the evidence that we have of it is that if you look at the sort of composition, the demographic composition of the Baloch movement, you will notice that it actually comprises a lot of literate and middle class people. So I'm not sure if you guys heard, but about 6 months ago, there was a blast in Karachi, I believe, that was done by a Baloch female who actually was a mother of two. She was an MPhil degree holder, and she was teaching. And she very openly undertook that suicide attack. She killed herself. Her family made out a statement that we're proud of her. And similarly, you have a lot of sort of army commissioned officers in the Pakistani army who absconded from the military, who were running the campaign for or running the insurgency for the BL is the Baloch Liberation Army, the BLF is the Baloch Liberation Front. And so you notice sort of this, and if you compare that with the Taliban, which doesn't sort of have this demographic, ethnic, or social makeup, you'll notice how that composition reflects the frustration of the Baloch, right? So there's this middle class that lacks this upward mobility, lacks this sort of ethnic nationalist expression, and claims that its voices have been subjugated or silenced, as they claim. And that has actually led to sort of fueling a lot of this frustration and fanning these flames of violence, I guess. Yeah. I also wanted to just throw in a slide on CPEC because it's very pertinent. It's also very, as I'm sure, controversial. A lot of states have spoken out against it. They've claimed it goes through disputed territory. Pakistan's official narrative is that it's sort of the panacea to Pakistan's economic problems. But I wanted to look at it. I wanted you to look at it from the angle of Balochistan. So I personally feel, and I think this is a sentiment shared by a lot of people, that CPEC can't really take off unless you actually address Baloch grievances or the problems that the Baloch people face. So one of the flagship projects of Balochistan, of CPEC, is the Gwadar Seaport. It's always touted as this deal breaker. It's sort of seen as this alternative to Dubai and this place that will really sort of revolutionize or alter Balochistan's fortunes. But if you were to think of that narrative and juxtapose it with what's happening currently in Gwadar, where the Gwadar Ko Haq Do movement started a few months ago, and what that means is give Gwadar its due rights movement, you notice that there's a lot of sort of that same tension that I've been talking about evident on the ground as well. So what this movement did was, and it was led predominantly by females, by the way. So at one point, there were close to 10,000 females, burqa clad, hijab clad, who were sitting on the streets of Gwadar, and they were claiming that the Gwadar seaport will not be developed. CPEC will not move forward unless and until we are guaranteed basic rights such as water and electricity. So again, notice that contradiction. So on the grassroots level, on the ground level, you have these females, you have this population that's supposed to be benefiting from this project, but they're protesting against that project, claiming that it's not actually addressing our needs or taking in our aspirations or our values. And then you have this federal government or this sort of centralized state that claims that, okay, this is that one sort of answer to all of your problems. So that contradiction, this sort of dilemma and conflict has been at play since 1947. And until and unless Pakistan resolves this, CPEC will continue, or especially Gwadar will continue to sort of remain hijacked or difficult to get off. So this is one slide that I wanted to sort of have a personal take on. Like I said, I went to Balochistan in 2021. So I was the topper of the civil service exam in Pakistan, and what they do is that they send toppers to the hard areas first. That's how I ended up in Balochistan. So when I went to Balochistan, you're young, I studied in the US, I went back, so I had these aspirations of change. I still do, but it's just, when reality hits you hard, you become a little jaded. And that's exactly what happened to me. So like I said, I had a certain academic background, I had the merit and the sort of standing to go with it. but I just could not find a good posting. I wasn't able to sort of, get the posting that I desired or that I felt I deserved, because there was all of this political interference. There was sort of this hijacking of the administrative bureaucratic setup by the political landscape, and everything was just so compromised that I felt, my hands were tied. You had to make a decision, you had to take action, but you realized there were all of these sort of centers of power that were bearing down upon you that really limited you. And all of this, I mean, is very unfortunate. I'm not sort of complaining, I'm just sort of telling you how things are. And I think a lot of it, sort of, or most of it, just stems from how Balochistan has been unable to sort of, evolve or develop politically and economically. So there's this power vacuum that's been taken up by certain institutions, that's been taken up by non-state actors, and it just really sort of derails the entire system. So as an example, let me tell you about when I was in Khuzdar. So by the way, Khuzdar is one of the most turbulent areas in Balochistan, and it's also the political hotbed. So several chief ministers, three of them actually, belong to Khuzdar, and that was my first posting. So imagine, coming from the US and sort of being thrown right into the deep end into Khuzdar. And when I was there, what we tried to do, there was recruitment happening in the health department. So there was a lot of posts, like 400 or something, and we had to recruit vaccinators, there were medical technicians, and my deputy commissioner, who's sort of the administrative head of the district, he was very particular that we'll do everything on merit. So we had this very transparent system where we took a test. The test didn't have names on it. We had, like, those code slips. I personally managed everything, and we were so proud of what we were accomplishing and achieving. But while we were sort of about to announce the results, the entire recruitment process was cancelled. So just because it couldn't sort of be influenced, it wasn't sort of as, according to the norm, all that recruitment stopped. So imagine, 400, 500 vacancies lying absent. Imagine, living in a far-flung village in Balochistan, and you go to the healthcare center, you see the doctor is absent, you see the sort of woman medical officer not present because A, they haven't been recruited, or B, if they've been recruited on the whims of certain individuals and enjoy the patronage of that person's individual. So you can't take action against them. You're like, okay, why aren't you on your job? And they're like, do what you can. There's nothing you can really do. There's no sort of retribution. There's no sort of accountability. There's no transparency. And another thing that I noticed was how compromised the writ of the state is. And I think after this presentation, it sort of becomes evident why that writ has been compromised, right? Since 1947, it's just been so turbulent. It's always been seen through this security and garrison and lens of as a military garrison, that you couldn't sort of establish that grassroots structure, both on a political and on an administrative level. And I'll again give you an example. So when I was in Quetta, for instance, so a lot of state land. By the way, there is no record of of land in Balochistan. So let's say if you're living on the land, it might actually be owned by somebody else, and the papers, and it might be owned by somebody else, and you might be living there, and you might have sort of leased it out to somebody else. So you can't really trace ownership. So there's a lot of problems with land. So a lot of land is also illegally occupied state land. So we try to extricate some of that state land from encroachers or occupiers. But when we actually sort of did our findings, we realized that the people who were sort of occupying the land were more heavily armed, more dangerous. The police feared them. And to be honest, the police and a lot of people in the administration were actually involved with them. That's how they got through in the first place. So there's this utter lack of state writ. There's this lack of transparency and merit, and that sort of reflects into these horrible indicators, social indicators. So I've seen very decrepit health departments. I've seen schools. I wish I'd actually taken. I didn't bring those pictures, but we actually developed a school in Quetta, the first in that area, through donations. But had I shown you the pictures how it was before, people were just literally sitting on the ground. There was this like meek shed that was covering it, and they were exposed to all kinds of elements. So it just really sort of is heartbreaking for you. And that's one reason why I actually shifted from Balochistan to Balochistan, because I just felt the system was too stifling to sort of let you express yourself openly. So yeah, that's an unfortunate reality. This is just sort of one quick slide. I think I want to leave more time for us to sort of have an interactive session. But I feel like these steps are necessary if Balochistan is to improve. And I think the first and the absolute necessary step is that the democratic process must continue. Any form of intervention, any form of derailment of the system is not only going to damage Pakistan, but threaten Balochistan's connection with the country as well. So any form of military dictatorship, any form of sort of external intervention will be detrimental to the province. Apart from that, I think there's this need for provincial autonomy, respecting autonomy, this decentralization, and that's sort of the theme of the entire presentation, where you need to sort of accept the fact that Balochistan needs to have this provincial autonomy. It needs to be responsible for its own destiny and fate, which has not been happening. Then finally, I feel like there's this, you need a new approach, a more fresh approach to the violence and to the terrorism in Balochistan. And you need to move away from the security-centric approach, because it's not worked. Since 1947, you had such a strong military presence, and you still haven't been able to curtail that or silence that. So if something hasn't worked for 75 years, I think it's about time that you move forward. In terms of the economy, you need to sort of move away from the economy, see how you can promote tourism. There's a lot of natural minerals, natural resources in Balochistan, but again, the caveat is that when you exploit or take out those resources, just make sure Balochistan gets its fair share. That's something that the constitution protects. And finally, because this refers to me, I think this takes security of tenure in the bureaucracy, making sure that we move towards a more sort of efficient administrative system is really necessary to improve governance in the province. Finally, here's a list of recommended readings. These are fantastic books. You'll get first-hand insight into how Balochistan is. I would really recommend you reading this. The first ones are more about sort of the things that we talked about, so Pakistan's issues with colonialism, decentralization, identity, and then you have sort of how Balochistan evolved or responded to that. That's my email. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abraham. That was really good. Like you really took us on a journey starting from the beginning, and it was super useful context. So the picture you painted as the first question was rather grim in terms of inefficiency, and I was particularly despondent about the merit-based recruitment process you were running that just got shut down. And I'm wondering, just based on your experiences, just because at Accountability Lab, we're always looking at the positive deviance approach. What would you say are avenues, positive avenues that could be leveraged to influence the efficacy of the civil service in Balochistan?
Balochistan specifically?
Yeah.
I think so. You need to sort of find, like you said, avenues that allow you to, or that sort of share the values that you uphold. So I think one thing that one could use is civil society in Balochistan, because you have this sort of vibrant middle class emerging that's fairly educated, that is exposed because of through, let's say, international immigration and immigration to other parts of Pakistan. So you could leverage those sort of connections of civil society to burden or to sort of influence the political stakeholders or actors. So I think that's one element that you could do. Second, like I said, the previous chief minister, Jam Kamal Khan, he actually was working on this excellent initiative that was sort of the chief minister's, I don't remember the exact name, but there was this accountability portal that allowed you to sort of measure performance of civil servants and brought sort of a modicum of merit and accountability in the system. But that's been shut down. So since the government transition, that operation of that sort of department is no longer operating. But I feel like even within the political class, certain sort of, so Jam Kamal is Western educated, you have sort of these young politicians who are coming up who have that exposure. So I think you could sort of use those networks. You could, even within the bureaucracy, I feel like, because a lot of this young blood is coming in, these people who are foreign educated, who have sort of exposure about accountability and fighting corruption. So I think these are networks that one could leverage. It is an uphill battle, simply because everything, in my opinion, is hostage to how sort of the political setup evolves. But maybe through civil society, operating through, let's say, the civil service, and like I said, certain politicians who share or whose vision aligns with yours, I feel like slowly, eventually, we could get there. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, I don't know if it was too concrete or not, but
There's no easy answer.
So is anybody in the chat room actually? I'll share it now. Is there anybody who would like to talk, who would like to ask a question to Abraham? Like Anything else? Oh,
Oh, Lee.
well, Mr. Lee has a question if you'd like to answer it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for enlightening presentation. It gave you a lot of good context, and also for, it's good to hear your own personal story. You have a tough job. I've been to Kuzdar, Pishin, and Quetta, so it's a not an easy place to work. I did have a question. You did sort of touch upon in the last slide, sort of decentralization, and you did talk about the NFC award a little bit. But maybe two-part question is, one is, the 7th NFC award did sort of address some of the grievances of nationalist parties and others, and they did get more money. But what do you see as like? Sorry, my daughter's here; she's homesick. So that's why I'm not there in person. What do you think there's like sufficient resources there available for the government to operate? And then maybe the second part of that question is the local government system, elected local government system, I should say, has just been installed. Is it, do you think that's going to be something that can address some of the issues in terms of autonomy or decentralization? And of course, the big question is whether it will continue, because we've seen local governments discontinued time and time again. But is this a sort of avenue for accountability in governance?
Yeah, thanks so much for that. First of all, I hope your daughter's feeling better now. We are missing your presence in person. So I think when you sort of think about this question, it's really sort of important to understand what the issue is. So I think first, like you said, there's this issue of resource crunch, right? So when the 18th Amendment happened, when the NFC award happened, one major question was that you're taking a lot away from the federal government and giving to the provinces, which don't have the capability of managing those extra resources or dealing with the extra responsibility. But I think that's the wrong way to look at it. So the issue isn't sort of, the fact that they can't deal with it. I think the problem is that they've never been sort of given the opportunity to do that, and they sort of lacked that infrastructure. So the only way to develop that infrastructure is to give them that platform, trust them with those resources, because things have improved. So because you've sort of worked on governance, you've noticed how KP has really revolutionized its administrative, structure and its bureaucracy, and it's actually very transparent, very fair in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, and similarly in Punjab, under what happened in, let's say, Shahbaz Sharif, how infrastructure took off. Sure, there were problems of, let's say, distribution of resources between central Punjab and south Punjab, but those things only sort of evolve or rectify themselves or mitigate themselves when the system continues. So I think instead of sort of reneging or rescinding back on the 18th Amendment, back on the decentralization track, we actually need to sort of power through it. And another thing that I would add, I think another caveat about sort of decentralization in Pakistan is, as I'm sure you're aware, if you look at the history of local governments have actually never been able to take off in Pakistan, right? So they always happened under military governments. So Ayub Khan had local government systems, Musharraf did, Ziaul did, and what history shows is that they did that to bypass sort of the power centers at the province. So that's not really decentralization, right? So for instance, if you have to devolve power to city governments in a place like Lahore, you can't bypass the PML Noon or the PTI in today's world. But that's what they did. So, and if you look at the local government acts as well, so the most recent ones as well, they've inserted all of these really sort of questionable stipulations that actually really disempower and disenfranchise local governments. So I would argue and I would contend that local governments and decentralization hasn't actually really been able to take off in Pakistan. And to see how they've really done well and whether they can actually cope with it, which I think they can, and which I think is the only way forward, you actually need to trust them more, come up with legislation that actually genuinely empowers them and gives them the scope to improve infrastructure, economy, and governance. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay, first of all, a very brilliant presentation, very well structured.
Thank you so much.
I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Shah Sharif. I'm from Pakistan. I'm currently on a fellowship with State Department.
Excellent.
And there are a couple of things that really hit me hard. in your presentation. Like when you were talking about the civil servants in Balochistan, I remember in 2016 one assistant commissioner was shot.
From customs, I remember.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Hmm.
So what Jam Kamal was doing to enforce and like new regulations on the civil servants, it's only making things difficult for the people. Like the civil servants, they're already the best of best, doing their best, and there is no security. But I believe, as you said, the political system has to continue, and that needs to be solved politically, not bureaucratically. So, second thing, as your position, you censored a lot of things like informal Afghan migrations,
Yeah.
a lot of people. So I really understand that from your point of view. And as you were saying that it's really hard to regularize the economy, informal economy. At the same time, the turbulent things have already shrunk the civil society spaces. That's really hard. That's becoming really hard for people to work in Balochistan alongside the government to develop politically and on the development side as well. So, having said that, as you were telling about your school initiative from the donations, I'd really like to know more about it.
Sure. I mean, first of all, thanks so much for your kind comments, and you're absolutely right. I remember the assistant commissioner who died. Just for context, if I can sort of share about that, he sort of, because he was in the customs, he sort of took action against this smuggling ring, this mafia, and he broke up the mafia. But over the next few days, when he was heading back, they actually sort of attacked him and they beat him up, and he died on the way to the hospital or in the hospital. So that was a very tragic incident, and just sort of goes towards all the things that civil servants and normal people have to face. So, so you mentioned sort of the initiative. It's Alhamdulillah, we've gotten a chance to do a lot. So, in when I was in Quetta, we established the first ever girls' public library in Kili Nasran, which is a suburb of Quetta. We developed this school through all of this was done through donations. So we developed this school that, like I said, was literally kids just sitting on the ground. There was no roof, but now it has 4 classrooms, a library, swings, solar panels, and a boundary wall as well. So we added water filtration sources. We gave water sources to 60 households in a similar neighborhood. And now that I'm in Gilgit-Baltistan, in Skardu, again, we've developed the first ever public female library in Skardu. That was an initiative that my wife and I took. And so since you mentioned it, I've started going on and on. My apologies for that. But one initiative that I'm really proud about is that as of now, we are 99% done towards establishing the first ever blind educational institute and a vocational center for the disabled in Gilgit-Baltistan.
That's lovely.
Yeah, so it was alhamdulillah all our sort of my wife and my initiative. We got the donations together. It was close to 3 million rupees. We got the land. Taking land from the government, although I am a government officer, is a pretty difficult job. But we got it done. And so now what we've done is we've signed MOUs with an NGO. So we've recruited 7 people there. We've added solar panels. There's Wi-Fi. So they're going to be taught in MS Office and social marketing. We're starting off programming as well. And then we have capability. We have 10 sewing machines as well for the disabled, and 10 and the equipment to teach 10 blind students in Braille at one time. So yeah, this is something that we've sort of done in personal capacity. This is something that I'm passionate about. Yeah.
That's really nice.
Yeah,
That's really nice, and it's really, I can understand it's really hectic for managing a government job and doing all these projects. So
it's rewarding, I would say.
It's really great.
Thank you, means a lot.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely amazing, and just shows that things can be done even in the most difficult of circumstances.
Right.
Just a real quick question from me. Thank you for your presentation. It was absolutely amazing.
Thank you.
I just want to ask you one question that has something to do with where I'm from.
Yeah.
So you've talked about how insurgency, like with certain groups, can't really arise when there is an economic inequality or there's some sort of like economic deprivation.
Yeah.
We have a group like a group of fighters in our country who are fighting for independence.
Yeah.
They have been fighting for like 50 years now, and since the British colony like left country. So, and it's not, I mean, the purpose, like they're not like a religious group like the Taliban.
Yeah.
So their goal is to establish an independent state.
Right.
And they use economic inequality, all sorts of problems as a, as an excuse to achieve their independence.
Yeah.
So how can identity crisis, fuel, maybe economic deprivation, can potentially create space for these groups to fight for independence?
Right. I think that's a wonderful question.
Yeah.
And I think the first thing I would say is, elements of movements like these are unique to each country, right? So I'm not familiar with what's sort of the insurgent movement is in Ethiopia, what's that grounded on. But in Pakistan, so that's sort of one of the premises that I started about, was that Pakistan's been sort of in this constant struggle for identity, right? So what does it mean to be Pakistan? Like, there's no God but Allah, right? So I mean, that's what they say, but how do you sort of look at it from the fact that, there was a lot of Hindus in Pakistan, there was a lot of sort of minorities, and at the same time, not a lot of people wanted Pakistan to become a theocratic or an Islamic republic, right? So, and then in terms of that Islamicness or that religiosity, you add elements such as Urdu. So, I will tell you this: the Quaid-e-Azam, in his very short reign as the Governor General, he visited Dhaka, which was now the capital of Bangladesh, once, and when he was there, he made this statement, and I want you to sort of think about this statement, which is he said that the language of Pakistan will and only will be Urdu. If anybody else tells you otherwise, they are the enemy of Pakistan. So notice this conflation of, this otherization, right? Okay, so if anybody who doesn't align with Urdu or with this Islamicness is automatically an enemy of Pakistan. And there's actually, I didn't add the book there, but there's a very good book called Speaking Like a State. You might want to read it by Alisa Ayers, that talks about why Urdu was chosen was because it had these common elements with Arabic, right? So the script is similar, we borrow a lot of words, and Urdu sort of transcended that regional element. So it wasn't Balochi, it was this sort of cosmopolitan, cross-cultural language that borrows from Turkish, that borrows from Arabic, that borrows from Persian. And one reason, so Bengali, one reason why Bengalis were pretty mad was because they felt that Bengali should be the national language, because 48% people spoke, or 52% I think spoke Bengali. But one reason, and this is documented, one reason why Bengali wasn't embraced was because it had very similarities with Sanskrit or with the Devanagari script, right? So they felt that there was sort of this element of Hindi that they wanted to detach. So I can't answer your question in terms of Ethiopia, but what I can do for Pakistan is, I think, because there was this conflict of identity right at the heart of the Pakistani nation state, that sort of led into the Pakistani state being very insecure. It led into sort of this movement towards centralization. And because of that centralization, you couldn't sort of devolve power to the provinces. You couldn't sort of say, okay, Balochistan, here's your pool of resources, do your thing. Kind of like how it is in the United States, right? So you have like these very autonomous states. But a similar thing couldn't happen in Pakistan because there was this very genuine fear of Pakistan breaking up. And because of these sort of existential threats from India, there was Afghanistan. So Afghanistan claims a large part of Pakistan as its territory as well. So I think because of that, and this led to this identity crisis, that identity crisis led to this over-centralization. That over-centralization further triggered these sort of ethnic insecurities and sort of these ethnic separatist sentiments. And that led to, a lot of this violence.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
You have Isabella.
Yep.
Hello, I am also in the same boat as our online guest Wilson. I'm homesick with my daughter.
We can't.
Something. Oh, you can't hear me. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
It was my earphones, and I was same boat as Mr. Wilson Lee, homesick with a child. So it must be something. But back to your presentation. Thank you for the fascinating and informative slide deck and engaging conversation. I have a question about the multidimensional poverty. So in your presentation, you mentioned that Balochistan has 71% of the population that lives in multidimensional poverty. How does that compare to the overall Pakistani population? Is the 10% coming from a multidimensional poverty figure or overall? Because just two questions in there. how is this measured? Is this based on the MPI that was developed at Oxford that doesn't include income as an indicator, right? And then versus how is that related to some cash transfer programs that I had the chance to discuss with you on Monday briefly when I saw you. Is this somehow utilized in the program that has surpassed BIS, so SAS? And if
Yes.
not, what would be
Sorry, please. Yeah.
or drawbacks from doing it? And I'm so sorry to keep you over time, but if you can give me a quick answer or we can chat later, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, no, not a problem, and I hope your daughter is feeling better. So yeah, so basically this as you said, the multidimensional poverty index is based on the MPI. I personally don't remember what the exact sort of indicators were, but you know how it's sort of like based on multiple things. There's nutrition, there's health, so all of that together sort of form the MPI, and that's where this data comes from. So when it says that 10% of Pakistan's entire sort of poverty, or the poor population lives in Balochistan, it's based on the MPI. So it's not just your poverty line or the absolute poverty, it's the MPI factor that goes in. As far as your other question is concerned, which you were discussing the other day about the SAS program or the Benazir income support, I actually don't know if it's based on these MPI statistics or not. And I think that's something that I would love to explore more. And I could probably get that information, but I just don't happen to know that now. But I would imagine, because how the SAS program works, and you were one of the first ones to develop it, I think how it works is because it looks at household poverty, and it determines. So there's a score in the SAS program. You have a score of 0 to 6, and that determines, you know, where you fall on that particular level of poverty, and then whether you're eligible for that cash disbursement program or not. So I would assume that it is based on the MPI, but I can't give you a very concrete or exact answer for that. But I can look it up over the next few days, inshallah.
Okay, thank you so much.
Okay, inshallah, it's just
I understood that part as well. Thanks so much, Abrahim. This has been a really wonderful event.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me the honor and the opportunity.
Thank you so much. I'm sure those of us in the room can continue.
Thank you.